The following video is reposted on all my social media channels as a public service and in defiance of big tech, deep state censorship. You can do your part to defeat the Orwellian Nazi cabal by sharing and reposting this video on your channel.
It's our purpose to bring to bear the principle of common sense and rational discussion to the issues of our day. America was created at a time of great turmoil, tremendous disagreements, anger, hatred. There was a book written in 1776 that guided much of the discipline of thinking that brought us to the discovery of our freedoms, of our God-given freedoms. It was Thomas Paine's Common Sense, written in 1776, one of the first American bestsellers, in which Thomas Paine explained by rational principles the reason why these small colonies felt the necessity to separate from the powerful Kingdom of England and the King of England. He explained their inherent desire for liberty, freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and he explained it in ways that were understandable to the people, to all of the people. A great deal of the reason for America's constant ability to self-improve is because we are able to reason, we're able to talk to each other, we're able to listen to each other, and we're able to analyze. We are able to apply our God-given common sense. So let's do it. Hello, this is Rudy Giuliani, and I'm back with you with Rudy Giuliani's Common Sense. And today we have a very special guest. I consider him to be one of the best journalists in America. I think a lot of other people do too. He's an old-fashioned journalist and journalist executive. He a great investigative reporter, very, very careful about what he prints, make sure that it's solid. I've worked with him on and off over the years, and I have to say, he's what they used to teach in journalism school a journalist should be and should do. He's been with the Washington Post, the Washington Times. He was editor-in-chief of the Washington Times. He's been with The Hill, vice president of The Hill. And now he has his own podcast, and he has his own website, justthenews.com, and John Solomon Reports, and that's on Apple and iTunes. And I can't think of someone who breaks more stories and has better sources than John. So at the end, we're going to ask him if he'll give us one little special tidbit. But what I want to start with, John, first of all, welcome and thank you for being on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and congrats on the success of your podcast. Well, everybody's talking about it, so that's really fantastic.
Well, John, it seems like two things have kind of collided together in the last couple of weeks, maybe even longer than the last couple of weeks. One of it is this, when the pandemic and the fact that it looks like China had some kind of deliberate involvement in spreading it, whether they created it as a weapon or not is in doubt. But once it was loose, it looked like they sent people all around the world to spread this pandemic, either negligently or on purpose. And then we've got the connection of American politicians with China, the most prominent being this whole situation with Hunter Biden, which people may forget. So I wonder if you could take us through this, because you've written about this extensively, and I think it'd be really helpful if we could go through the timeline of Hunter Biden's involvement and the Biden family involvement with China.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great timeline. And oftentimes, as you know, when you put facts into a timeline, the story becomes a little more clear. And so
absolutely,
let's take people back to November of 2013. The Obama administration had just started its second term. Vice President Joe Biden was in charge of a lot of policies. The two most important foreign policies that he oversaw were the China relationship and the Ukraine relationship. And as we now know very well, Hunter Biden appeared to flow in the jet stream of the vice president's jets and his policy responsibilities and collect some real money. In Ukraine, as we know, he gets hired on the board of Burisma Holdings in the spring of 2014. And he's paid over $3 million, or his firm's paid over $3 million over 2 years to be a board member on a Ukraine gas company that was under criminal investigation in Ukraine at the time he was brought aboard, and at the time that his father, the vice president, was overseeing Ukraine policy. Same sort of scenario occurs in China. And we know this thanks to the great work of Peter Schweitzer, the author, journalist.
He put this in a book a couple of years ago, right?
He did.
Somehow it was ignored.
It was, but the detail is extraordinary. It's careful. It's well documented. Yes. It's been, for the few people who have dug into it since then, it's been affirmed over and over again. But let me give you the timeline, because the Peter Schweitzer version of the story starts in December when Joe Biden goes to Beijing, and who ends up on Air Force Two with him? None other than Hunter Biden. So he's going on his dad's official government trip to China aboard Air Force Two. But a month before that, this is a fact that came into evidence after Peter's book, Hunter Biden and his business partner, Devin Archer, the same guy that works with him in Ukraine, they set up a new investment firm called BHR. And they hire a guy in China, or connected to China, by the name of Jonathan Lee. He has connections, at least according to the public reporting, we believe, with the Bank of China. And so they set up this investment firm about a month before Hunter Biden just gets the idea that he should jump on the plane with his dad and go to China. And so he goes to China. What we now know from Mr. Lee, who gave an interview last year that brought some new light to this. So the guy who's running this investment firm that Hunter Biden and his business partner set up, a guy named Lee, he gets a meeting with the vice president in the lobby of a Beijing hotel during this trip. So Hunter Biden jumps on the plane. He's got this new investment firm. The guy that's going to run this investment firm just happens to get a meeting with the vice president while Hunter Biden's on the plane. We don't believe in coincidences in Washington. I doubt that was a coincidence. And then about 6 months later, the Wall Street Journal, this is in July 2014. So now Hunter Biden not only done this trip to China,
so Hunter Biden flies on Air Force Two to China with Joe.
Right.
And Joe is supposedly negotiating as a point man for the United States to try to get China out of the islands they were militarizing.
Right. There were many issues for that time. Right. There were trade issues with steel and other things. So it was a very important issue. A lot of U.S. policy was discussed during that trip.
And what was Hunter doing during the trip?
It's unclear, other than we know for sure from Mr. Lee that Hunter set up this meeting with the vice president. So Hunter Biden arranges for his dad to come down the hotel into the lobby and meet with this new official who's going to run this firm that he and his partner set up called BHR. And then 6 months later, the Wall Street Journal has a story saying that BHR is trying to raise $1.5 billion, mostly from the Chinese. So the fund gets set up. The vice president meets with the Hunter Biden's executive, or the guy that's going to be the executive of this firm. And then within 6 months, the call's put out that there's going to be a $1.5 billion raise by this firm. Now, it's always been very difficult to understand how much of that money was actually raised. Peter Schweitzer couldn't get to the bottom of it. I have spent a lot of time looking through documents. It's pretty clear it probably didn't get the full $1.5 billion, but it got several $1 million. And what it appears to be is about 50% of whatever money it raised came from Chinese companies, some with ties to the Chinese government.
Did some of it come from the Bank of China?
It's unclear. It looks like to be, the Bank of China is involved in all of this, but it's unclear actually who puts the funds into this BHR. There's a nebulous set of documents, and there are some missing steps in the timeline. It looks like the Bank of China is somehow involved, certainly in the raise of the money, and in their contacts with Mr. Lee, if the reporting is correct, and then there are other companies that look to be in contact with him, but. What we do know now is that Hunter Biden's lawyer, belatedly because of all the spotlight that this has gotten, has now told some media that Hunter Biden actually set the firm up, but he didn't take a financial stake in it until October of 2017. And at that point, he bought a 10% share of the firm he had created back in 2013 with Mr. Lee and Devin Archer. And he paid $430,000 for it. So if you do the math, theoretically, the fund, at least in 2017, was worth at least $4 million. Doesn't sound like it got to that $1.5 billion level that had been aspired to reach when they first announced the big number in July of 2014. But whatever it is, we know about half of the money comes from China from regulatory findings. We know that Hunter Biden bought 10% of it suddenly in 2017, and we don't know what else transpired. It's a big, giant black hole.
It's basically a private fund, correct?
That's right.
And
that's right. So we don't have that visibility.
Do we know who the partners are in the fund?
We do not. The records are not clear. There's Hunter Biden and Devon Archer appear to have a role in setting it up in 2013, the month before. Mr. Lee, Jonathan Lee, appears to be the CEO or chief executive for the fund. And it basically operates in a nebulous environment over the last 4 or 5 years. And why is this important? We know from investigations going all the way back to the 1990s in the Clinton White House, when we had the Asia money fundraising scandal, that the Chinese don't do anything with Americans unless it's part of their larger strategy.
Right.
They have right. They don't throw money easily and willy-nilly at people. And oftentimes they don't even do it just because someone's famous. They do it because they want something. They have an investment need. They have a strategy need. In some cases, the Pentagon and CIA tell us it's an espionage need. So when we look at this, we have more questions than we have answers, right? What we need to know is who were all the investors that put the money in, and what's the total amount of money that came from China? What were those investors' interests? What did they ask Hunter Biden, Devon Archer, or anyone associated with this firm to do them any favors or to do them any introductions, to intervene on any policies? Did any of those policies or actions affect American national security? We don't know an answer to that yet. And have any of the companies that put money into this, have they ever been on the blacklist? America has a blacklist managed by an agency called OFAC. If you're an enemy of the United States or doing something bad, violating embargoes, you get put on this list. We don't even know if any of those investors were on that list. Those are the sort of questions that Hunter and Joe Biden, I think, are going to have to answer before Election Day 2020.
Now, according to Schweikert, in his book Secret Empires, which interestingly the subtitle is How the American Political Class Hides Corruption and Enriches Family and Friends. In the book, he says that he believes that Hunter Biden, Devon Archer, Chris Hines, the Bank of China, and James Bulger were all involved in the fund.
Yeah,
How does James Bulger, the nephew of Whitey Bulger, get involved in this?
That's where there are different financial institutions that at various times touch this fund, and one of them is one out of Boston that Bulger apparently had an association with. Again, there's very little visibility. I mean, Peter's done a great job of putting all the data points that are public together. But there's a lot of questions here that aren't answered. And Mr. Lee, the chief executive, has done a few interviews. He's given up something we didn't know originally, that Hunter Biden arranged the meeting between himself and the vice president. So BHR, brand new in December 2013, gets a meeting with the vice president. That's big juice. But we really don't know much else about what the fund did over the last few years. I've been doing.
In the middle of this, Devon Archer gets prosecuted for a separate crime, correct? So he kind of
2016,
he kind of comes out of it, right?
Yes, he gets charged with some allegations related to conduct involving an American Indian firm, and he's convicted, and then the conviction is reversed after the trial,
and it's still
he's never been recharged.
I think it's still pending for decision as to whether to recharge him. And also there's some suggestion that Chris Hines at some point pulled out, like he did out of the Ukraine, but there's really no evidence of that.
Yeah, because it's so private, there's so little information that we can really see from this, and that's why, whether Congress or the Senate or investigators take a look at this, there are all these questions that need to be answered. Now, we have one interesting visibility point. If you remember last year when I did a lot of the Ukraine reporting, I was able to get a document that the FBI seized from Devon Archer, so Hunter Biden's business partner and good friend, and it's a bank record a series of bank records from a Morgan Stanley account that they had in New York. And that's the recipient account. It turned out I got lucky, where a lot of the Burisma money came in, the $3 million plus that came in to their firm, Rosemont Seneca Bohai. Well, that's where the money for that. But there are other transactions in there for which we do not have any explanation for. Devin Archer, Hunter Biden, the Biden campaign have refused to give us answers. One of them is very interesting because it's a few months after this December meeting in 2013. Early 2014, there's about I think it's about $2.2 or $2.4 million that comes into Rosemont Seneca Bohai in a transfer. The destination inbound, where it came from, we do not know, but it does occur in the short period of time right after this China meeting. We just don't know if it's related to Ukraine, if it's related to China, related to a completely different investment. But that's been a financial transaction that I've been trying to do a lot of reporting on. And I think one of the things I'm doing right now is I have filed FOIAs across the government to find out, did Hunter Biden contact anyone about China or any China companies? Was he at the State Department, the Commerce Department,
right.
Trade? So that's a place where we might be able to force some visibility and see if he was doing any work on behalf of Chinese investors or people that were interested in this BHR. But right now, sadly, we have more questions than we have answers.
Well, I mean, and sadly, there's never been investigated.
Yeah,
by anyone.
Not. Other than Peter Schweitzer, who did a lot of great statements.
It is rather remarkable that this kind of allegation could be made about the Vice President's son and the Secretary of State's stepson, and it wouldn't be investigated. I think if it involved two relatives of Donald Trump and Vice President Pence, it'd be investigated immediately.
Oh, 100%. Now, let's go back. I mean, let's go back to an earlier time when I learned my journalism back in the 80s and 90s. I remember when George Bush Sr.'s son, Neil, was involved in an SNL, and the media was all over that. Every aspect of that got covered inside and out.
Right.
But there doesn't seem to be any curiosity in the current American media to look deeper into this or to follow what Peter Schweitzer has done. And that's a disservice to the American public. We should get answers.
It becomes an even greater disservice when you consider now how paramount the relationship with China has become because of the pandemic and the possibility that China utilized that in some way to attack us in the West. And China's clear statements that they want to be the dominant power in the world, which means they want to push us aside. His relationships with China, any presidential candidates, are even more important.
Oh, 100%. And, I think whether by fate or luck or all of the above, Joe Biden and China are going to be, China's going to be an issue in which this whole election turns over the next few months. We're going to be talking about bringing supply lines back to the United States and manufacturing back to the free world. In the meantime, there are two very different visions of China. President Trump has one. He ran on it in 2015 and 16. He's very clear about how he views China. Vice President Biden has had a very different view, one that a lot of people call conciliatory or not appreciating the risks that China poses to America's future.
Even within the Obama administration, that was a problem. You can go back to contemporary articles when the department moved from Hillary to Kerry, that one of the points made was that things for China would be much better under Kerry than they were, that China was much happier with Kerry than with Clinton. And then during that meeting that took place in December of 2013, when Biden returned to the United States, he was criticized for failing almost completely in his negotiations with China. So in essence, what you have is he takes his son to China, he's negotiating for the U.S., he fails, and somehow the son comes back with this amorphous, very strange, conflicted business deal that they don't want to talk about.
That's for sure.
So how that can't be investigated, given the circumstances in the world right now, particularly when you consider that Joe Biden is probably the only American politician who has said that he doesn't think China's a threat.
He's had a very different view. He's at odds with even people in his own party. I
don't know anyone that John Kerry agrees with him that China's not really a threat. And I saw Elliot Richardson the other day say we really shouldn't bother China because really they're more powerful than we are.
Yeah,
so, I mean, this is
a scary thought to even hear those words uttered.
I know it's going to be a very interesting election when when we start focusing on it again. So, John, and you always have something up your sleeve. So, I heard that laugh.
Yes,
I've heard that laugh
I'm
often
guilty as
enough.
charged on that one. Yeah.
And I know. I want to tell people this about you because I've worked with a lot of investigators, journalists, and with law enforcement. John is probably one of the most careful people you're ever going to meet. I mean, I know personally situations where other reporters would easily have printed it, and John needed a second source or he needed a document, or I'm not going to do it until I get the document. This is an extraordinarily careful guy. So
Thank you.
I've found everything that you've printed has turned out to be 100% accurate. And some of the stuff you didn't print, other people would have gone with it, sensational.
Yeah, we try to be careful, and
No,
we try
you are.
to.
I mean, it's extraordinary
we try
how
to be
careful you are.
transparent too. I always try to post my documents so people don't have to take my word for it. They can click through and look at the documents themselves. And I hope more journalists ascribe to that in the future because I think it would bring some credibility back to my profession.
What the left wing has done to you just because you had the audacity to, I think it's because of Biden, because you defended Trump and you raised these issues about Biden, which, I mean, it's almost self-evident that you have to raise them. I think they forget that you were the 208 Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award winner, the 2002 AP Reporting Award winner for your exposing what the FBI knew before 9/11, which leaves you with a few enemies in the FBI, by the way, John, just out of the nature of things.
Yes.
You were one of their darlings.
It's true, and
you're the same man.
It used to be reporting was appreciated regardless of who the beneficiary was, and today we seem to pick winners and losers. And
are we going to fix that double standard, John?
I hope so. Listen, the most powerful people. The most powerful people are the American public. If they want to punish the people who are transgressors, stop buying their media products, stop consuming it. Send a message to those news organizations that we're tired of the lies. We go back, you know this, Mr. Mayor, because you worked so hard on the Russia investigation. You go back to 2017, you can find hundreds, if not thousands, of erroneous news stories about the Trump collusion conspiracy with Russia that, by the way, never existed. Not a single one of those newspapers have corrected their record. And I look back at times and I wonder what's happened to my profession. There's an ethical, moral obligation to go back and say we got those stories wrong, and yet they don't do it.
Well, John, this is an odd kind of story, but it just, and the only reason I'm going to mention it is because it's so glaring. But here you have these allegations about sexual assault by Biden. I don't know if they're true or false, and I always go by you got to presume the person to be innocent. But they don't. I mean, they completely crucified Kavanaugh on one woman who was uncorroborated. And then every time they tried to corroborate her, they found out it wasn't true. I mean, they went to her friend. Her friend said, I don't believe it's true. They went, no, not true, not true, not true, not true, not true. This one, everyone they've gone to now, 4 people corroborate it. And they don't cover it. How can they get up in the morning and go to work?
Well, I thought the most insightful interview I saw, and this was a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times editor himself just admitted flatly they used a different standard for Kavanaugh than they did for Biden. In fact, I think if I remember the words correctly, he said the Kavanaugh story was a hot story, so they had a lower standard for facts, and they were much more careful and reticent to go with the Biden story. What could be more hot? What could be more
the president of the United States?
Yeah.
Or does the president of the United States have a conflict with what appears to be our biggest adversary, China? Right?
Yeah, it's willful blindness in my mind, and it's sad because we weren't this way that long ago, but we've become this.
We've got to correct this. I believe if we're ever going to really come together in a way that's useful to public policy, we're going to have to overcome this glaring, dramatic double standard. But tell me what's up your sleeve, John.
So later today, I'm going to be working on a document I got from London. It's very interesting. Christopher Steele had another round of testimony, this time in court in London, and it just hasn't gotten any attention in the United States. But it has some very important revelations, and it goes back to another same theme, questions that the American media have not asked of Hillary Clinton or Susan Rice or Barack Obama. So Christopher Steele, in sworn testimony in a courtroom in London, in a defamation suit against him. There's a bank in Russia that sued him for defaming them, or some of its officers sued him for defaming him. He brings out some brand new information. One of them is he understood from the beginning, meaning in July when he approached the FBI with his first dossier, that the end recipient of his work was Hillary Clinton, and specifically that she was read into his work. That's the first time we've heard that, the first time that we knew that. So it, again, begs a question that I've been asking for a couple of years and have tried to get Mrs. Clinton to answer. What did you know and when did you know it? We don't know anything about when she was briefed, what she knew about the Steele project, whether she knew he was going to the FBI. Those are questions we need. But he threw some other names out there. He, in a later part of his deposition, he mentions that he gets to the State Department. This is a story I actually broke about the Kathleen Kavalek, Christine Steele meeting, October 2016, a month before the election. Steele breaks rank with his FBI handlers and goes over to State and blabs everything he's working on, admits he's leaking to the media, admits he's got a political deadline of election day to get his dirt out on Trump. And he says in the meeting who arranged the meeting. He said it's a guy named Jonathan Weiner, who was a State Department official at the time. And he just out of his own, just blurts out that when he learned from Strobe Talbot, longtime friend of the Clintons, former Deputy Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, that Strobe Talbot was aware of his work on Steele back in July 2016, the same time he thinks Hillary Clinton knows he's working for her. And he says that Strobe Talbot tells him or intimates that Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor for Barack Obama, is aware of what he's doing, and that John Kerry may be aware. These are spontaneous, extraordinary admissions. We're gonna put the actual words out there today. I'm going to put the transcript out there today. But these are questions that Barack Obama and John Kerry and Susan Rice and Hillary Clinton ought to answer. What did you know about the Steele dossier, and when did you know it?
And of course, all of this was ignored by Mueller, right?
Absolutely. In fact,
no attempt even to try to. You're the one that had to go get this, right?
Right. Absolutely. About the only thing that Mueller did on this front was that one of Christopher Steele's big lies was the famous Alpha Bank conspiracy. This was the idea that Donald Trump had a secret communications network with Vladimir Putin that went to his bank server. And that was bunk. I knocked that story down in late 16, early 17. But the media particularly CNN, kept flogging this one forever. In an offhand moment and during his testimony, he basically said, that's one of the few things I'm sure is inaccurate. It's one of the very few things that Robert Mueller did that strayed from his report, because he didn't even address the issue in his report. But he questioned it. But that's about all he ever addressed about Christopher Steele. And thank God we're getting declassification.
We're going to look forward to following this. And John, I have to tell you, it's been an honor to work with you, and I've learned a great deal, and I've got great confidence that there's a lot more that you're going to reveal that'll help our country. And you're doing a great job. Thank you, John. Thank you very much. I appreciate
it. Good to be on your show. Proud to be on your show.
Great to have you, and I look forward to being on yours.
Okay, that's a deal.
Thank you. Well, that was a wonderful interview with John Solomon. I don't mean to say that John is old. He isn't that old, but he's like a throwback, right, to what journalism was all about, what it really was all about, which is you go after the bad guys. You hold public officials accountable. You don't check their party registration when you do it. And if you're going to go after a Kavanaugh for some kind of allegation of sexual misconduct when he was in college, and now you got an allegation of sexual misconduct against a guy when he was the United States Senator who wants to be President of the United States, one wants to be on the Supreme Court. I mean, why do you cover one but not the other? Because one is a Democrat, you don't cover it, and the other's a Republican, you cover it? I mean, that isn't America. That's called basically unfair. And I find it hard to believe that these people can live with themselves doing this. I don't know what you say to yourself about your honesty and integrity. And I could illustrate this double standard with, we'll do a special just on the double standard, and it might take a couple of episodes to go through it, but I'm committed to ending it. This has to go. We got to get rid of it. America can't tolerate something like this. But thank you, John Solomon, for your great work, and we're going to take a pause right now, and we'll be back with Common Sense. Hello, this is Rudy Giuliani, and I'm back with you with Rudy Giuliani's Common Sense, and today we have a very distinguished guest, Dinesh D'Souza, who is a prolific author, 21 books, some really, really big bestsellers, including one that's coming out soon, we're going to be talking about, the United States of Socialism, which is very, very provocative and very good book. I believe it's 5 documentaries, one of which just about the highest grossing documentary ever. The others almost as prolific. The most recent, Death of a Nation, which I highly recommend. It's a comparison of what the Democratic Party did to Lincoln and what the Democratic Party is now trying to do to Trump. It's certainly thought-provoking. And Dinesh, thank you very, very much for being with us. So we can talk about this, because I think this book, which isn't quite published yet, is coming out at a very, very auspicious moment, because I think we're seeing some of the things you predict here kind of work out. The idea that in the book you make it very clear, as any educated person knows, that socialism has failed every time it's been tried, 20 sometimes, 24 or 25 times. But that almost always it morphs, if it doesn't start that way, it morphs into authoritarianism, sometimes to the point of homicidal authoritarianism, but always authoritarianism. And I just have this feeling that there's something like that going on with this pandemic, and the failure of a lot of the Democratic governors to give up the control that they've gotten over people's lives, right down to telling me what kind of medicine I can use at home or in the hospital. So maybe you can explain this, better to people, because this is a fabulous explanation. I want people to make sure they read it.
I started the book long before the coronavirus epidemic. I did so because it struck me that socialism, this idea that had been discredited in the 20th century, when I came to America in the late 70s, about half the world lived under socialism. This was actually a very powerful movement. And then it collapsed. And it collapsed not because it was tyrannical so much as it collapsed because it was an economic failure. That's why the Soviet Union gave it up. That's why China moved from socialism to a kind of state-run capitalism. But I saw this socialist virus, if I can call it that, making its way into America, not just on the fringe with the Squad and even Bernie, but penetrating the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And it was presented as democratic socialism. And so, and it's also a weird type of socialism we have because it's married to identity politics. It's married to the politics of race and gender and sexual orientation, which makes it a lot different than the socialism of Europe. So I wanted to take a hard look at it, and little did I know that we'd be in this new situation where in some ways through the control imposed by coronavirus, we're getting a taste of both economic socialism in the form of red lines and ration products and limits on what you can buy and shelves that are empty, and also in the sense of the suppression of civil liberties. That's been very chilling to see, a country built on civil liberty jettisoning and giving it up without so much as a thought. And people, mayors, governors saying things like, well, I wasn't thinking about the Constitution, as if that's just some sort of optional document.
Yeah. I think it was the governor of New Jersey, Murphy, said almost as an afterthought when he was asked about the constitutional rights that were impaired by not going to church and not being able to go out and not being able to go to work, he said, that's above my pay grade.
Right.
He takes an oath, like I did when I became mayor. One of the things, you take an oath to enforce the Constitution of the United States. It's part of your job. And he said it was above his pay grade.
I think part of it is that when people use the phrase democratic socialism, they seem to think that if you can get a political majority to agree to something, then it has automatic moral sanction. But that's actually not true. If you have a gang of 10 people, 9 people cannot gang up and take away the property of the 10th guy, nor can 9 people go to the 10th guy and say, listen, you don't have a right to speak, you don't have a right to vote, you don't have a right to assemble, you don't have a right to religious freedom. The key thing, the key insight of the Bill of Rights is that it is not subject to democratic mandate. It doesn't matter if 9 people or 90% of people disagree, I still retain those fundamental rights. Why? Because I never gave them up to government in the first place.
Well, I think part of this is the failure to understand history among a large part of our young population. I mean, after all, Hitler was elected, and Stalin was elected, and Khrushchev was elected, and probably they would have been elected. Well, Hitler was elected in a free election. They selected Hitler, and you know, if they had a chance to do free vote, they would have selected Stalin. And right now, Russia, Putin is a democratic choice of Russia. It doesn't mean he isn't an authoritarian, but he's the democratic choice. But the Constitution basically says that certain rights are beyond democracy. Certain rights are so important, God-given, if people that don't believe in God, I guess, naturally derived, that they're so important, they can't be altered by a majority vote. They're inherent in being a human being. You're entitled to practice your religion, free speech, and et cetera.
Well, this is a critical point because I've seen people on social media saying, well, we're closing the bars and we're closing the restaurants, so we can close the churches also. But no, there's a big difference. There is no constitutional right to operate a bar, but there is a constitutional right to freedom of religion. It is specifically protected in the Constitution, so it doesn't have the same status as doing something else. So you're right. There's a failure here of education. I think it's also the case that the progressives have done a lot to camouflage history, to tell a fake narrative, if you will. A lot of my work has been aimed at deconstructing these fake narratives that have been used to cover up, in many cases, the crimes of the left and of the Democratic Party, to camouflage, for example, the fact that Hitler and the Nazis were on the left. Most of those guys were professed socialists. All the founders of early fascism in England, in Belgium, in France, in Germany, in Italy, all of them were men of the left. This is not taught. You won't see it on Wikipedia. And so this distortion of facts and of history, very concerning to me. Orwell predicted it, by the way. Orwell knew that socialist countries erase history and rewrite history to make it convenient for their ideology.
Actually, when you say that in Wikipedia, where they talk about you, they say that the idea that the Nazis derived from the left has been disputed by numerous sources. But then they don't list any sources. They don't list any sources.
Yeah, I mean, I list those sources in my book.
I know you do.
Because I know that the left does dispute that. But you have to realize that prior to World War II, socialism was widely recognized as, National Socialism, fascism, was recognized as on the left.
That was the name of the party.
That was the name of the party. FDR in the 1930s sent members of his brain trust to fascist Italy because he saw Italian fascism as more progressive than the New Deal. Mussolini reviewed FDR's book about the New Deal, says it's a great book. He goes, this is kind of what we're trying to do in Italy. So all of this stuff that's there in the historical record is not in our textbooks. Our young people aren't taught about it. And this is partly why they become such suckers for the new types of ideologies, because they're not anchored in history.
Right, and it's as if this is a new philosophy that they've invented and hasn't been tried before. In fact, in some of their rhetoric, you'll hear that, like we've never really tried it in America. Well, of course, it's been tried every place else and failed.
Interestingly now, the only place where there is a kind of socialism that does work is Scandinavia. And so, of course, the left is fleeing to Scandinavia. They're like, we want to be like Norway. We want to be like Sweden. We want to adopt the Scandinavian model. And yet the Scandinavian model is very different than anything that the left is trying to propose here. First of all, the Scandinavians do not kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. In other words, they may be socialist in economic distribution, but they are not socialist in wealth creation. Their policies are pro-capitalist. Their business tax rate is about the same as the United States. They don't have any minimum wage. You can hire and fire people for any reason. The level of regulation is low. There's no wealth tax. There's no inheritance tax. They tried universal basic income in, I believe, Norway. They got rid of it. So the kind of financial transaction taxes that Bernie and Elizabeth Warren have talked about, you won't find those in a single Scandinavian country. So the bottom line of it is, the left is touting a model that they themselves have no genuine interest in. They don't want to do what the Scandinavians do because the Scandinavians want to create turbocharged wealth first, then talk about distribution.
And so then how would it describe itself as socialist? So so we can understand it.
Yeah, so their socialism is in the wealth distribution side, but it's very important to realize that the Scandinavian model is that we are a single tribe. In other words, we're sort of like the old Vikings. When we get some booty, we get some kill, it has to be shared among the tribe. But here's the key point.
And of course, they're very small countries as well.
They're small countries and they impose the burden on everybody. So in other words, let's take, for example, these high Scandinavian taxes that the left loves, taxes of 60 and 70%. Here's the point. In Scandinavia, if you make 60 grand a year in most Scandinavian countries, you will pay that top rate. So the top rate is imposed on the middle class. It's not confined to the super rich. There's no demonization of the millionaires or billionaires. The Scandinavians basically say we've got to not soak the rich, but soak everybody. And in fact, as you know, in Scandinavia, as in most of Europe, you have a VAT tax, the value added tax, 25%, by the way. And the VAT tax, which is on consumption, is notoriously regressive. Regressive means disproportionately the poor pay more.
It's a sales tax.
It's a sales tax. And so the Scandinavians, in other words, impose the burden on the whole society. They don't rob Peter to pay Paul. Whereas the left here is promising people, I'll give you free stuff. You'll get free college, free education, free this, free that. Why free? Because we're going to get some other dude to pay. You don't have to worry about it. That is not the Scandinavian model. The Scandinavian model is everybody has to pay.
And that's kind of what the pandemic has gotten us into right now. People have been out of work now for 5-6 weeks. And many of them are being paid. They're being paid by the government through welfare. And this, I think, is a very comfortable, for example, my mayor, de Blasio, who took his honeymoon in Cuba. He's very comfortable with this. Everybody's home. We're totally non-productive. We haven't produced anything in 5 weeks or 6 weeks. And people are being paid who want to be paid and want to get welfare. Meanwhile, the small entrepreneur is getting ruined. The small businessman, the people that have relatively small businesses, they're getting completely ruined, and they don't seem to care about that.
Yeah, if you look at this model of essentially having no lasting employment, sitting at home, pontificating all day. This was basically Bernie Sanders' lifetime model until he was about 50. In other words, from the age of about 20, when he finished college, till he entered politics, he had no means of support. He was writing articles in socialist weeklies and hippie monthlies. He was getting $25 or $50 here and there. He was sleeping on his neighbor's couch. He was tapping his next door neighbor to get electric utilities. I mean, it was the lifestyle of a sort of lifelong bum. I believe he even joined a commune in the 70s that was based upon growing your own food. And they threw him out because he didn't want to grow his own food. He just wanted to pontificate about politics. So he wouldn't even carry his weight in a hippie commune. And that's Bernie. And he was a serious candidate for the Democratic nomination. In fact, had the establishment not sort of rallied around Biden and sort of rigged it a little bit, Bernie would probably be there. That's where their heart is.
And possibly even in 16. Possibly. I mean, if there was a real primary in 16 without all the fixes that the Clintons put in, I'm not sure that he certainly is the heart of the party. That's where the emotion. There was really very little emotion for Hillary, and I think Biden is just. They believe he's the only one who can beat Trump, even though he looks like he's falling apart.
Yes, I mean, he's essentially they've gone for the guy in the rocking chair, I think, with Biden. And maybe they're hoping that this will convey a sort of non-threatening, harmless type of image. I think the Democrats probably think we can manipulate Biden like a puppet so he won't really be doing anything. But interestingly, all the Democrats have, if you think of free markets on one end of the spectrum and socialism on the other, and ask yourself just this question, is there a single Democrat that's pulling the tug of war in the free market direction? No, they're all pulling in the socialist direction to one degree or another. It's creeping socialism with Biden. It's explicit socialism with AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Bernie Sanders, but they're all tugging in the same way. And to me, it's quite striking to see how the kind of socialism that was almost taboo in the Democratic Party 10 years ago, 15 years ago, is now completely mainstream. You look at Biden's set of policies, they are by and large the mainstream of the Democratic Party, with just a few exceptions.
Well, I think they also intimidate. It seems that the few Democrats that would want to oppose, in the House, for example, are afraid they're going to be challenged in a primary. They're afraid that they're going to be taken out. To some extent, I think it's even affected Nancy Pelosi, because she's desperate to remain the leader, even though it's kind of pathetic. And she seems to have gone much further left than she ever was before.
Well, I think they realize that the mainstream media is on the far left. They're to the left end of the Democratic Party. So the way that you get the full protection of the media and the full support of Hollywood is by pivoting further left. If you're a kind of centrist Democrat, they're going to try to get rid of you, root you out. And so Democrats have realized it pays to be on the left, because not only do we have the Democratic Party, but we have this kind of protection racket called the New York Times, CNN, and so on. And it gives us a sort of immunity. No matter what, look, even Biden's getting it now. No matter what Biden does, even if Biden came out and said, oh, yes, I molested Tara Reid, I think the media would do their best to minimize it and say, oh, you know what, he's just saying that, and this just shows his unbelievable honesty, and this is what distinguishes him from Trump. He's willing to admit his failings. I can just see it. So there's a sense in here that he can do the Clintons. Look at Bill Clinton. He could do no wrong. And he remains a sort of totemic figure to this day in the era of the Me Too movement.
How do we, I don't think we can exist permanently with this double standard.
There is no way.
I remember maybe it isn't quite at the level of, Lincoln's statement that we can't exist half slave and half free. But I don't think we can exist as a fair, decent country when Biden's son can go get a no-show job from the crookedest man in Ukraine while Biden is negotiating as vice president for the United States. Clearly it was a bribe, and it's completely ignored. And if Trump did anything like that, or me, or a Republican, we would be on the front page of the Times forever and ever. And then we have the clear Kavanaugh example that is staring you right in the face. I mean, the allegation against Kavanaugh was less substantiated than the one against Biden. They both were seeking a very high position, Supreme Court Justice, President of the United States. Kavanaugh was lying. She was telling the truth. You can't dispute a woman. You can't embarrass her by disputing her. Men should keep their mouths shut. Meanwhile, same allegation, except more serious and more corroborated, completely ignored. As if it's not relevant. The woman in that case should be totally disrespected. How do they, maybe this is a stupid question, but how do they go to work every day?
Here's how. I think this is a profoundly important point. Years ago, when I was in college, I was complaining to a professor of mine about a double standard. And I kept saying, here is this gaping double standard. And my professor said to me, he said, Dinesh, there's no such thing as a genuine double standard. It's a double standard on the surface. When you look underneath a double standard, you will always find a single standard. So let's take, for example, the free speech movement in the 60s. They were like, we were for free speech. But the moment they got into power, they were happy to impose regulations because they never were for free speech. They were for free speech for us, but not for you. No tolerance of the intolerant. That was their philosophy. So similarly here, there's no real double standard. The press, the mainstream media, and Trump, of course, says that the Democratic Party is the political arm of the media. I almost think it's the reverse. That the media is running the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is the political wing of the media. And their single standard is if it harms Trump, it's news. If it harms Biden, our job is to cover it up. And it doesn't matter what the it is. Now, interestingly, when you talked about Biden running the racket in Ukraine, this is another feature of, you may say, American socialism that resembles Venezuelan socialism and not Scandinavian socialism. You could not name a single politician in Scandinavia who has gone from $0 to $40 million like Obama, or $0 to $100 million like the Bidens, or $0 to $200 million like the Clintons. Nobody is able to make cash out of politics that way in any Scandinavian country. But if you go to Venezuela or a lot of third world socialist countries, You've got these kleptocratic dictators, and they are looting the country, looting its oil wealth, and so they become millionaires and billionaires off of politics, and that's what we're beginning troublingly to see in this country.
I think that's very, very interesting because if you think about it, the vast majority of socialist countries, particularly the ones that were part of the Soviet bloc, were riddled with corruption, and to some extent they still are, even as they've come out of communism, because it was so much a part of the culture. And you look at the Democratic Party, certainly under Biden and Obama, Biden made those deals in every country that he operated in. He walked away from Iraq with a big contract for his brother James, about a $500 million housing contract to build housing in Iraq. James was not a builder, he was a lobbyist, right? He walked out of the Ukraine, we don't know how much, bare minimum 12 million, could be more. And then in China, he got China to invest in this ridiculous private equity fund in which they won't tell us how much money he made, but they committed up to 1.5 billion. So his son, outrageously, was a partner with an entity of the Bank of China while he was negotiating against China. My goodness, I mean, that's a conflict that just smashes you in the face. Your failure to cover that has to mean that something seriously has gone wrong with your ability to be fair.
Absolutely. I think, to be honest, that you're describing the gangsterization of American politics, the fact that American politics, there's a kind of crime family element that's come into it. Now, I think if we look back historically, it wasn't there before. I mean, we wouldn't see Truman or JFK. JFK had plenty of his own money, of course, or even Jimmy Carter. They weren't doing this. So we'd have to say that it began, I think, in the Clinton era in the 90s. It reached a kind of apogee or summit in the Obama era. And Biden is now, continuing, you may say, the crime family tradition. So as Republicans, we're dealing with a new type of challenge, a Democratic Party that's not the same as it was before. The reason I mentioned the Lincoln analogy in Death of a Nation, the movie, is because when Lincoln came to Washington in 1861, he realized that politics had changed. The Democratic Party had become gangsterized then. They had become more violent, more extremist. They were not the same party that they had been 10 years earlier. And so Lincoln realized, I have to be a lot tougher. Even though I came from the moderate wing of the party, I've got to be a lot tougher now because I'm dealing with an adversary that has become more barbarian and more savage.
Well, I think that's very, very true. I remember as a prosecutor in the 80s, and I did a lot of public corruption, a lot of corruption investigation of congressmen, Republican and Democrat. And I was a Republican, but I never had a feeling that there was too much difference. I thought the big city Democratic parties were much more corrupt, and there were no Republican big city parties to compare to them. But except for the big city corruption that was exclusively Democratic, the rest of the corruption, counties, and were pretty much both parties. I used to have a saying neither party has a monopoly on virtue or vice. With Clinton, that changed. I wasn't a prosecutor in that era. I was a mayor. In fact, I served with Clinton for 7 years. We overlapped. And basically, the Clintons were small-time grifters who moved up to middle-level con men, and then they became world-class con men with the Clinton Foundation, which is a screaming outrage of corruption. And one of the things that Peter Schweiker did in his book that brought this out is point out that we've adopted a Chinese method of corruption in which you don't get the money directly, but it goes to your son or your brother or your best friend, and then they take care of you. Well, that's clearly what the Bidens have been doing for 30 years, clearly what the Clintons were doing.
I think, I know, absolutely. I mean, in my case, I came of age politically in the Reagan era, and I looked at American politics as an honest debate between two camps, that had rival ideals that they were passionately committed to. So Republicans might prefer equality of opportunity. Democrats may prefer equality of result, but both sides believed in it. And so politics was a kind of national debate or referendum on which side the public preferred. It's only later, once I had my campaign finance case, once I dealt close up with the apparatchiks of the Obama administration, I realized, no, there's a gangster element in politics that goes way beyond these this is not a debating society. These are ruthless people, and they will use any means necessary. And they didn't view me as a critic or a dissenter or somebody who's on the other side politically. They viewed me as an enemy. We've got to take this guy out. And if we can use the power of the state, it doesn't matter if we've never prosecuted anyone in American history or locked them up for doing what Dinesh did. If we can lock Dinesh up on this pretext, let's do it.
Well, that's another dangerous aspect of what happened with the Clintons and with the Democratic Party, where the criminal justice system is being used as a political weapon by one side. Only the Democratic side uses it as a political weapon. Democrats don't get prosecuted for the same thing that Republicans get prosecuted for. And that's completely alien to what I knew of the Department of Justice. And I have to tell you, it probably breaks my heart more than anything else to see that happen. And I just don't think we can have the America that we want until we find a way to balance this and get this sickness out of our system. But nobody has done more to help do that than you, Dinesh, and I'm really appreciative of the time you've given us. And this book, I recommend it to everyone. This is going to be a very valuable book, particularly since what we've gone through and then the election that's coming up. So congratulations.
Thank you very much.
You're a great American.
Thank you.
So I think that was a really good interview with Dinesh. You can see why he has had so many very successful books and documentaries, and he's one of the most wanted speakers in America. It's a great deal of wisdom, but also explained in a way that is accessible to all of us. So thank you very much, Dinesh. You did a great job, and we'll be back with you in a short while. Thank you. Hello, this is Rudy Giuliani, and I'm back with Rudy Giuliani's Common Sense. And today I have the great pleasure of interviewing Andrew McCarthy, former Assistant U.S. Attorney who prosecuted the Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman case, one of many, probably the most famous. And I remember early in his career, he was part of the Pizza Connection case. And he has one of the most distinguished records of anyone in the United States Attorney's Office. And since then, he's become one of the principal writers, philosophers, thinkers. He works for the National Review. You see him on Fox all the time, and has written several books, and probably is one of the more sought after guests to comment on legal matters. He's just a great lawyer, has a great deal of common sense, which is why we have him on the show, and also very often has his own very unique take on things. He spent a lot of time in working in these areas that we're going to talk to him about. We're going to talk about the Flynn case. I'm going to talk to him about some of the legal ramifications of the shutdown. So, Andy, it's great to have you on.
Rudy, it's great to see you, and I appreciate you mentioning all those things. The proudest day is still the day you swore me in.
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, you've done terrific. So, shall we start with Flynn?
Yes, sir.
I mean, aside from his lawyers, I don't know anyone that knows the case better than you. And can you take us? I mean, can you sort of summarize for us, because there's been so much confusion about how it started and what the problems are with it right now. I mean, everyone knows somehow he was charged with lying. He pled guilty to lying. There was a point at which the FBI thought he didn't lie. So his advocates say he pled guilty because he was forced to do it because of his son. And the people who are his adversaries say, well, he lied to the FBI, and therefore he's got to take his consequences.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to understand Flynn's case is to understand why I think they brought Flynn's case, which is that he was an obstacle to what the main objective of both the Obama administration working in conjunction with the FBI at the time was. And that was, once Mrs. Clinton lost to the president in the November election, the goal was to continue the investigation that the FBI called Crossfire Hurricane, which was really, I think, always trained on President Trump. And what they wanted to do was continue it despite the fact that he was president, which is a tough uphill battle, you would think, because the president, of course, has the ability to shut down investigations, including counterintelligence, which was the guise under which they were doing this.
When they began the investigation, the counterintelligence investigation, he was running for office.
Correct. Yes, they began it. I believe, Rudy, that the investigation probably goes back to 2015.
Wow.
And that the CIA and the intelligence community overseas, as opposed to the FBI domestically, were the main players at the beginning. I think the FBI got more active as you got deeper into 2016. They formally opened the investigation at the end of July of 2016, but I think there was a lot they were doing before that. And they opened an investigation they called Crossfire Hurricane,
which was a counterintelligence investigation.
Right.
Not a criminal investigation, which explain the difference.
Yep. The counterintelligence investigation is not done as a criminal investigation, is to vindicate the rule of law in court proceedings. It's done to collect foreign intelligence to support the president's mission to protect the United States against foreign threats to national security. And in order to use laws like FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which we now know they used in this investigation, you basically have to allege that the person you want to surveil or the group you want to surveil are conducting themselves as clandestine foreign agents or clandestine agents of a foreign power. So here, they had this Crossfire Hurricane is the overarching, or what they call the umbrella investigation, and it has a number of subset investigations to it, one of which was called Crossfire Razor, which was the investigation of General Flynn. And I would just conclude in a conclusory way say that there was no basis, in fact, to believe that Michael Flynn, who was a 33-year-old decorated combat commander of the United States, was a agent of the Kremlin, which is essentially what the allegation was. So that was his investigation was handled as part of this Crossfire Hurricane. And I think if Mrs. Clinton had won, the whole thing would have gone away and you'd never have heard another word about it. But once she lost, then they realized that two things. Number one,
now they is Comey struck. Who are the masterminds of this? Who are thinking it up?
It's the intelligence community hierarchy of the Obama administration and the Obama White House. So, for example, right in the middle of all this, on January 5th of 2017, which is the day before then President-elect Trump gets briefed on the Russia investigation, there is a meeting in the Oval Office between President Obama, Vice President Biden, and Susan Rice from the White House side, and Jim Comey, who was then the director of the FBI, and Sally Yates, who was the acting Attorney General of the United States. And I believe also in on that meeting were some of the other intelligence chiefs, but they did not stay for the follow-on meeting because that was limited to people who were going to continue on in the Trump administration, namely Comey and Yates.
So this was after he was president-elect. He was elected.
Correct. Right.
But before he took office.
Right.
So sometime in November?
No, this is January 5th. It's the day before.
Okay. This is a January 5th meeting. Okay.
Right. Day before Trump gets briefed on the Russia investigation, and right before they orchestrate what turns out to be the leak of the infamous Steele dossier. But in that meeting, what they talk about is holding back information about Russia from the incoming team. That was clearly a goal that they had. And I believe the reason that General Flynn needed to be removed as far as they were concerned is unlike a number of the people who the new president brought in with him. Flynn was a veteran intelligence actor, an officer who had run the Defense Intelligence Agency and was a very savvy and experienced intelligence actor. There's no way they would have been able to keep from him the fact that both the Obama administration had investigated the Trump campaign, and unbelievably, they were continuing to investigate the Trump campaign and ultimately administration as the administration began. They were even then, Rudy, in the FISA court getting warrants,
right,
and making representations to the FISA court that they believed there was a conspiracy of cooperation between the Trump campaign and the Kremlin.
This is after the famous intercept where doesn't Strzok say there's no there, or
yes,
that they couldn't find anything.
Yeah, at a certain point they knew, and I think it's a certain point early on that they knew they did not have a case on President Trump, and they continued the FISA surveillance of Carter Page for almost a year, which allowed them to do a lot of collection of intelligence on people who were connected to the Trump campaign. But there was no there ever as far as showing a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and.
So they make a decision around January 5. We can't have Flynn around because if we do, we're not going to be able to continue this investigation.
I believe that's what happened, and it's ironic that it happens then, Rudy, because we now know that on January 4th, the day before, they actually closed the case on Flynn because they had nothing. But by a ministerial error, evidently, that Strzok ends up calling the FBI's utter incompetence, which he regards as serendipitous, they do not officially close the case in the system, even though they have a memo to the file that Comey has approved saying that they're closing the case on Flynn because basically they don't have any. It was ridiculous to ever think he was an agent of Russia to begin with. But they close that investigation, but they don't close it, and as a result, they
This is like the Keystone Cops if it wasn't so serious.
It's remarkable. But what they decide to do, I think, is a perjury trap, and they're led to that conclusion because they think of a few other alternatives that they might try, like doing a defensive briefing or using a defensive briefing as a pretext to get in and grill them. They have a bunch of proposals and they decide none of this is going to work. And what they meaning the agents,
McCabe, Strzok, Comey,
Lisa Page,
of course,
and Joe Pientka.
Okay, those are the main five people.
Right. So Comey has conceded that he, outside of protocol, decided to send two agents, Strzok and Pientka, to go interview Flynn on January 24th. And this is completely out of protocol because you're supposed to go to the Attorney General, who goes to the White House counsel, so that both the president's interest and the justice. By
this time, Flynn is now on the job.
Correct.
In an acting capacity, right?
The president, well, I think.
Or was he named?
He's White House staff. So
right, of course, yeah. Right, so he was just appointed by the president, straight out.
So the president's inaugurated on January 20th, and Flynn is interviewed on January 24th. And there's a weekend in between those two things where they talk about different plans for approaching Flynn. Ultimately, I think they settle on the perjury trap. And I think the idea of that was they needed to try to get Flynn to say something that wasn't true so that they could go to the White House and try to get him removed. There's
a quote from Page in one of the texts, I think, about get him off guard to get.
Yeah, well, that was about what were they going to advise him. You know, you and I know that when the FBI interviews somebody, even if it's like a drug dealer or a gangbanger or whoever it is, they always advise him of his rights up front. And they tell him, here's where you stand. They tell him, if you lie to us, we can prosecute you for that. They decide they're not going to tell Flynn any of that. And McCabe calls him before the two agents tootle over there. And it basically discourages him from getting a lawyer or from letting Don McGahn, the White House counsel, or Reince Priebus, the White House chief of staff, know that they're coming. And they basically show up at his door, and Flynn agrees to speak to them.
And this all gets kind of described by Comey as he wouldn't have gotten away with this if it were a more mature or an older administration.
Yes, he knows that he's supposed to go to the Attorney General, who is supposed to go to the White House counsel to get all this approved before you just show up and talk to the president's staff. And the other thing, Rudy, I think that's crucial to realize that they did here was they actually have a recording of the conversation between Flynn and Ambassador Kislyak of Russia that they want to ask him about. Now, in a normal investigation, as we know, if you're really searching for the truth and you're trying to get to the bottom of something, you play the tape for the guy and then you ask him, what did this mean? What did that mean? They agree before they go in, they're not going to play the tape for him. They're just going to ask him about a conversation he had a month ago with Kislyak. This is a busy government official who's had hundreds of such conversations in the ensuing weeks, and they're basically going to hope that he trips up.
So this is sort of a credibility test. I mean, they walk in, they know you had the conversation, they got proof of the conversation, and they want to see, are you going to say yes or no?
Right. And they're going to hope that he lies, because then the controversy going on at the time was whether he mentioned sanctions in the conversation with Kislyak. And they have reason to know, because they have the recording, that he did, even though publicly he said he didn't. There's a variety of reasons that may have happened, but suffice it to say, they think they have him. And what they're hoping to do is that he'll basically lie about it. And they're also at that time talking about the preposterous possibility of indicting him for the Logan Act, which is a moribund, unconstitutional provision that the Justice Department hasn't even tried to use since 1852 and has never successfully prosecuted against anyone.
And he would have had the additional defense that he was the incoming national security advisor and therefore was gathering information to do his job rather than presently setting policy, thinking about setting policy in the future, which was only a month away or a couple of weeks away. It would have been a totally ridiculous prosecution.
Completely. And I don't think the Justice Department would ever have actually pulled the trigger and done it. But to make a long, sad story short, they basically, Flynn has the interview. The agents are not convinced that he lied. In fact, they think that he didn't lie to them. And they report that to their superiors, who reluctantly tell Congress that the reason they didn't charge him at the time was the agents who interviewed him didn't think he lied. And then flash forward.
And this includes Peter Strzok.
Yeah, Strzok
the
and
agents
Pientka,
are Strzok and Pientka.
They are the agents.
They come to the conclusion that he didn't lie, that it was a failure of recollection or confusion. And there is some confusion about was he discussing it with him, or was Kislyak discussing it with Flynn?
Right. Who raised it? How did it come up? And some other details about other conversations that they had. So basically, the agents don't think he lied. They not only tell that to their superiors, Comey and McCabe, tell it to Congress when they get asked about it. And what happens we go forward to May of 2017, the president fires Comey.
The president had fired Flynn basically because of what they said, lying to the vice president.
Yeah, I think Flynn conceded that. I don't know if either Flynn or the vice president would say that Flynn lied. I think what they would say is that he gave him inaccurate information, which embarrassed the vice president when he spoke about publicly.
Yes, right.
So Flynn's continuing, given the press frenzy that was going on at the time, was untenable that he would hang on any longer. The president dismisses him. And then if we flash forward to May, which is about 3 months later, the president fires Director Comey. The next day or the day after that, acting director Andy McCabe opens a criminal investigation on the president for obstruction of justice on the theory that a president firing the FBI director is obstruction.
This is the first criminal investigation, actually, right?
That's the first time they openly
Open a
acknowledge
criminal
that they're
investigation of
Yes.
the president. So the criminal investigation is the president exercising his authority to fire an FBI director. But he did it for a reason that they objected.
Correct.
And that's obstruction of justice.
Yeah, and because their theory is that the president is interfering with their Russia investigation. And they don't mention the inconvenience that because the Russia investigation is counterintelligence, it's actually done for the president. So it's not their investigation, it's the president's investigation that the president is allegedly obstructing. I mean, it's hard to explain this. It's so incoherent. But they opened that investigation. The next day, Comey leaks his memo to the Times of the meeting he had with President Trump about Flynn back in February. And that, of course, fuels the claim that there's an obstruction going on. And then the next day, Mueller is appointed. And I think Mueller was basically looking at this as an obstruction case from the start.
So the obstruction facts against Trump are that he fired Comey, and the FBI director that he had a right to fire anytime he wanted. And he allegedly had this conversation with Comey 3 months earlier in which he told Comey to go easy on Flynn or be nice to Flynn or something like that, which Comey doesn't think is obstruction until he gets fired, because he never did anything about it. I mean, if you or I felt we were being obstructed, I mean, by anyone, you would report it right away, wouldn't you?
He would have been obliged to do it.
Right.
And he was asked, Rudy, about a week before he was fired, he gave congressional testimony
under
where
oath.
he was asked about whether he'd ever been pressured to bring a case for political reasons, and he said no, that hadn't happened.
So he wasn't obstructed for about 3 months, and then all of a sudden, after he was fired, he felt that he was obstructed.
Correct.
He got this sudden feeling that he was obstructed.
Yeah. Came on him like a wave.
Now, we should tell people that we both know him, right?
Yes, we know Jim for
I have
many
to
years.
I have to plead guilty to hiring him, and in your case,
I had a very good relationship with
So
him
did I.
For a very long time. I haven't talked to him for many years, but I've always had a good relationship with him when we had a relationship.
so now after we get finished with all this, how does this become an indictment?
Yeah, this is amazing. So after Comey is fired, we should note for the benefit of all these FBI guys, they did a lot of things I think that were wrong to General Flynn, because this investigation should never have been investigated. But they never charged him. The whole time that Comey was running the FBI and McCabe was there and all these, Strzok, Page, the rest of them, they never charged General Flynn.
Yeah, and also, I guess we should make the point, which we both know, there's a very small group of FBI agents out of the total number of FBI agents, and they're kind of politicized FBI agents, wouldn't you say?
I sure think so.
When they're in Washington, unless you do take steps to stop it, that's just going to happen. And I think it was the opposite here. I think these people, Strzok had been conducting political investigations for almost 2 years now. He did the crazy investigation on Hillary, and then he did the investigation on Trump that yielded nothing. So now he's doing yet another one.
Right. But he gets blown out of there in the summer of 2017. They remove him once they discover these text messages between him and Page. So this is a long-winded way of saying Flynn doesn't get charged until December 1st of 2017. And by the time that's by Mueller's team, by the time that happens, all these other agents are out of there.
And who makes that decision again, I don't think Mueller made the decision or was capable of it. Who makes the decision to fire him?
Well, Mueller's deputy is Andrew Wiseman, and the prosecutor who handles Flynn's case is a guy named Brandon Van Grack.
So they make the decision to, all of a sudden, after the FBI agents who interviewed him had come to the conclusion that he wasn't lying, something happened that brought them to the conclusion that he must be lying.
Yeah, and I really think, Rudy, that if you look at what was going on at the time, once they took the case in May of 2017, I think they looked at it as an obstruction case. They're trying to make a case on Trump. And the two things that they really do are they try to squeeze Flynn and they squeeze Manafort. And they really play hardball with those two guys. We're now seeing some disclosures come out with respect to Flynn and his camp has said this all along, that he pled guilty because they threatened to prosecute his son for a violation of the Foreign Agent Registration Act.
Which is also rarely prosecuted.
Almost as rarely, up until recently, almost as rarely as the Logan Act. That's right. I think 6 times in half a century before Mueller came along.
So they basically bankrupted him at this. I mean, Flynn, when he makes the decision to plead guilty, basically can't afford a lawyer anymore.
Right.
As I understand it. His son is being threatened.
Right.
And maybe someday we'll find out what Weissman was doing, but I know for a fact that Weissman was mentally pretty close to torturing Manafort for a long period of time and has a history of doing this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So they were pressuring him. They were pressuring him, and he pled guilty to end it.
Right. And then, so where we're at now is he's trying to get his guilty plea back, and his lawyer is trying to get the case dismissed on the grounds of outrageous government misconduct. A lot of that has to do with what appears to be lying and manipulation in connection with the 302, which is the report of the interview that they did with Flynn, which has some really funky aspects to it. And we'll have to see what the judge does.
And what do you think?
I think the judge will give General Flynn his plea back, which would put the ball in the Justice Department's court to say, do you dare come into federal court to try this case? He'll still, I guess, press the issue. As I understand it, by May 18th, all the papers have to be filed on the motion he's made to get the case thrown out on the grounds of outrageous government misconduct. But I'm not sure the Justice Department may not step up to the plate at a certain point and just say they don't want to go forward with this.
And just to complete the whole thing, Attorney General Barr has appointed, as he has done in a number of these situations, a U.S. attorney, a sitting U.S. attorney.
Correct.
And he's kind of like an independent counsel, or a special counsel.
A guy named Jeff Jensen. It looks like he appointed him probably early this year, 2020. He is the United States Attorney for St. Louis. I think that's the Eastern District of Missouri. And we'll see. He's the one who is probably responsible for the fact that we're now seeing a lot of disclosure that should have been made a long time ago that we hadn't seen up until now.
Well, that's about as good a description as I think anybody has had of the Flynn case. It really is a disgraceful chapter. Whatever you think of whether Flynn lied or didn't lie, and whether it was a failure of recollection or a deliberate attempt to conceal something maybe he thought was embarrassing or harmful or whatever, what they did to him, they did a lot more plotting and planning and surreptitious behavior than he did.
Yeah, and we know on the basis of a lot of experience that even if you had a really terrible bad guy, whether it's a mafia guy or a terrorist, if you treated a guy like this, you would, as the prosecutor, you'd be fried.
And I can't imagine in my experience in the Justice Department that anybody would do this. That you'd go kind of just test a guy's credibility. Maybe if you're going after John Gotti, even then I'm not sure you'd do it.
I just think a perjury trap's a tough thing to justify, particularly under these circumstances, and to do it in a way that you're hiding from the White House and the Justice Department that you want to go in to interview him is just inexplicable to me.
Well, I can tell you that's one of the reasons we didn't want the president to testify.
Right.
Not because we were afraid of what he was going to say, but we were afraid of what kind of tricks they're going to try to use. So I'm just going to ask you quickly, because we don't have much more time, about what is growing and growing and growing, which are the orders that were entered, these special emergency, let's call them dictates by governors, and also by the president originally, that you can't go out and you have to be 6 foot apart and you have to wear a mask and you can't go to church and you can't have a assembly to peacefully protest as the First Amendment guarantees. These are all things that are guaranteed in the First Amendment almost in exact language, right? The right of free exercise of religion, the right of assembly to petition your government. They're all suspended. Questionable where in the Constitution, what you say in your article is there's no pandemic exception to the Constitution.
Yeah, I wish I could say I came up with that myself, but that was the Attorney General Barr in the Civil Rights Division.
Well, it's excellent. I mean, there's no emergency exception. There's no exception. I have it here. There's no exception to the contract. There's no asterisk. There's no exception.
I'm glad you brought yours. I have mine here too.
It just says no law respecting, and then it goes on to mention all the rights. Okay, so sort of there's been sort of developed over the centuries, really, a sort of exceptional power that the president has. Like Abraham Lincoln exercised it and Roosevelt exercised it.
We had martial law in New Orleans in the War of 1812 toward the end of it, and it was Andrew Jackson was the general, and when a judge tried to issue an order on habeas corpus on someone he had locked up, he had the soldiers march the judge out of the city limits. So,
but now we're out of the emergency that whether it was exaggerated or not, and some of the numbers would suggest it is, but even the numbers that ended up being pretty high. So you got a good argument on either side of whether it was justified at the time that it was done. Now, in many of these cases, the situation is flattened. The curve is flattened. The hospital systems are not overrun. That was one of the main reasons given in the first place, that it had to be done to save our hospital system from being overwhelmed. Well, they're empty beds now. So how can the governor of Virginia tell people they can't worship? And more than that, the case that you're specifically talking about, it was like 12 people in a 255-person church that were going to Palm Sunday services, and the minister has a criminal citation. Doesn't seem like in America.
No, it doesn't.
Seems like some other country. Poland maybe 30 years ago.
Yeah. The Justice Department says, and I think this is really hits the nail on the head. The question is not whether some, in this case, I'm adding this in. It's not whether some Democratic governor decides that your job is essential or not, or that your rights are essential or not. The burden is on the government to demonstrate that your job or your essential or your fundamental rights cannot be exercised in any safe way other than the way that they want to restrict you. And it is true that the president has these emergency powers. There's no doubt that preventing infectious disease, the Supreme Court has said since 1905 that that's an important government interest. But when you're dealing with fundamental rights, the government can only restrict them with the least restrictive means that will work, that will allow them to do the thing that they have to responsibly do. And the critical thing the Justice Department keeps saying, Rudy, is that you can't discriminate against a person's either religion or fundamental rights. In other words, if you allow drive-through commercial arrangements so that you could go to McDonald's to a drive-through to get a hamburger, you can't tell people they can't go to a drive-through religious service because you don't think it's essential. They can't go to
drive-through confession or drive-through blessing or drive-through prayer.
Right. And the other thing the Justice Department says here is, look, if you're a business or a law firm, they're allowing you to operate. Your law firm can have meetings in your conference room where the people are a lot closer together than they are in that church. You can't say that the law firm can engage in its commercial activities, but that people can't go to church under circumstances where they're actually social distancing in a way that's safer than what goes on in our commercial arrangements. So they're saying you can't discriminate against people's fundamental rights.
Now, would that be any different? So we have the church situations, and then we have peaceful assembly, like the situation a weekend ago when a bunch of people were engaging in a peaceful protest. They seem like pretty normal people with American flags, and then you look a little further, and they have police officers in riot gear in California, guarding the Newsom's mansion or maybe the State House. I can't remember, but that seems riot gear. I mean, what kind of picture is that? I mean, that looks like what the Chinese were doing in Hong Kong.
Well, as somebody who ran the largest city in America for a long time, I think better than virtually anybody that political legitimacy in a lot of ways of what you want to do is more important than the niceties of the law. And what I mean by that is, in a country of 330 million people, you can't enforce social distancing unless you get buy-in and cooperation from the public. We simply don't have the resources that we could possibly do it, and no one would want to live in a country that functions.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Because, there's that old distinction in the law about things that are intrinsically criminal, mala in se, and then mala prohibitum. So this is mala. It's not intrinsically wrong to shake hands with somebody, right? And it's not intrinsically wrong to say a prayer together with somebody. So now there's a reason, and it has to be dealt with delicately. And people are used to shaking hands. People are used to going to mass and church on Palm Sunday, and to start using criminal remedies for this, and to start using the police with riot gear to enforce it. So the NYPD union has said that it will not enforce social distancing, which that's a heck of a confrontation. The police won't do it. And there's a rationale they could develop for that, which is, if it is unconstitutional for the mayor at this point to order it, because the emergency is not at that stage anymore, then it's unconstitutional for the police officer to do it.
Yep. And it's arbitrary.
And everybody took an oath.
Yep.
To the same Constitution.
I think the worst part of it is they are putting the police in situations where you're going to get the public to do the thing that in New York you tried so hard not to allow happen, which is that the police lose the influence and legitimacy and prestige that they have out on the street, which is essential to their ability to uphold the rule of law. And once you lose that, you have chaos. So I think a lot of these governments don't realize the fire they're playing with, but they're putting the police in a very bad position, I think.
Well, let's hope that the pushback through these court cases will kind of regulate this a bit, and also make certain it doesn't happen again too easily, because there is a slippery slope. We let this happen once, and everybody like sheep went into their house, didn't go to church, right? Didn't do the things we normally would do. We let it happen, but okay, enough's enough. And this is a place where these rights are guaranteed by God, not government. Or certainly beyond, if you don't believe in God, by nature. But they're beyond government. Government doesn't have the right to interfere with these.
Right. Our Constitution's there to preserve them.
Well, thank you, Andy. This was a really illuminating conversation, and I hope we can call on you in the future for going through these things, because I feel like in the next couple of months we're going to have a lot of this.
Thanks so much, Rudy. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Great to see you.
Thank you very much. That was Andrew McCarthy, as we pointed out, a former assistant U.S. attorney, one of the better and one of the very best assistant U.S. attorneys that I work with a great career of prosecuting all kinds of crimes, in particular terrorism, and now one of our leading commentators and writers on legal issues that intersect with political and other issues. So I thank Andy very much for participating, and we'll be back shortly. Well, I think you all found that to be a very interesting interview of Andrew McCarthy. The Flynn case has been talked about now for several years. A lot of controversy about it, a lot of opinions about it, and I think Andrew, probably more than anyone, could put it in a simpler context than most. Let me see if I can just make it even simpler. Here's the problem with the case against Lieutenant General Flynn. First of all, it's premised on an interview done on January 24, 2017, merely 3 days after he assumed his role as National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. It was set up by the director of the FBI, Jim Comey, and it was set up for the purpose of trapping him. I don't think there's any doubt about it, of testing his credibility, because they were going to interview him about a tape recording they already had. They already knew from the tape recording that he had discussed sanctions with Kislyak, the ambassador from Russia, and they were going to ask him, did you or did you not have conversations about sanctions? And they had no intention of showing him the tape in order to refresh his recollection, or find out what further information he would have about it, which is what you would do if you were seeking information. You would go and say, General, did you meet with him? Did you talk to Kislyak? And did you talk about sanctions? If the general says, no, I didn't, or I don't recall, you would play the tape for him and say, General, you did. So why did you do it? And give me more details about it. That's if you wanted to obtain information. Instead, Mr. Comey, Peter Strzok, an agent by the name of Joe Pienta, who accompanied Strzok, and I believe McCabe, who was the assistant director. I don't know if others were involved in that conversation. I think Lisa Page probably was. Came to the conclusion that they would sort of catch him off guard, would be a good way to put it, and not follow the procedures that they knew were the proper procedures to follow. So Comey knew that in order to do an interview with the White House staffer, and certainly of that level, but of any level, you had to go through the White House counsel's office so that the White House counsel could determine should the person be represented by counsel, shouldn't they? You had to have a discussion about that. Comey bypassed that procedure, knew it was wrong to do it because afterwards he bragged about it as if it was he said, and Comey said later that he knew he was supposed to do this, and if the administration had been in office a little bit longer, he probably would have been prohibited from doing it. But he knew that they would know, and therefore he could take advantage of them. And he laughed about it, and the whole audience laughed about how he violated these procedures that are intended to protect people's rights. I mean, rights are important, even for White House personnel, but they were treated with great disrespect, particularly with Comey laughing at them. But in any event, he calls. They set up the meeting with Flynn, and they tell him basically he doesn't need a lawyer. Certainly discourage him from having a lawyer, discourage him from telling the White House counsel about it. The two agents, Pienta and Strzok, come in and interview him. They have in their possession the tape recording of the conversation with Kislyak. They ask him about the conversation with Kislyak. In essence, in the answer, he says that he didn't discuss sanctions, and he didn't discuss sanctions with Kislyak, or didn't remember discussing sanctions with Kislyak. They leave the conversation. They go back to the FBI headquarters, and this is January 24th of 2017, and the two agents conclude that Flynn wasn't lying. They conclude from basically an observation of his demeanor, which Comey goes to great lengths to explain when he testifies before Congress, kind of bragging about his expertise in being able to determine whether someone's telling the truth or not. That in assessing his demeanor, they had concluded that he wasn't lying, that he wasn't deliberately lying. So the case remains dormant. Subsequently, on May 5th, I believe, Comey is fired. Thereafter, a criminal investigation begins for the first time. McCabe starts it. And Flynn isn't prosecuted, a criminal investigation of then-President Trump for obstruction of justice in firing Comey. And all of a sudden it's revealed through a leak by Comey, which is a violation of rules and pretty close to a violation of the law. Comey leaks this memo in which he says that President Trump or President-elect Trump told him to go easy on Flynn. Actually, it would have been President Trump at that point, and that this is more or less evidence of an obstruction. Of course, it had happened way back in January, and for all those months, it wasn't an obstruction. He never raised it. He never told other agents about it. He never reported it. He never said or felt that he was obstructed, and all of a sudden, after he's fired, he suddenly feels he's obstructed, and McCabe seizes on that as another thing to investigate for corruption. But still, it has no effect on the Flynn case. Last thing we heard of Flynn was the agents didn't think he was lying. And all of a sudden, in December of 2017, they prosecute him for lying. How they changed their mind about it is a very interesting thing. How do they come from we didn't think he was lying till he was lying. We've never had an explanation of. And then he eventually pleads guilty, but only after he becomes pretty close to bankrupt, has no money, and they threaten him with prosecuting his son for violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is rarely, if ever, prosecuted except by Mueller, who used it also against Manafort. Although I think in its history, there'd only been 6 prosecutions. So what does this all add up to? To me, I think Andrew McCarthy is right. If it weren't such a politically sensitive case, I think it would just be dismissed. I think any judge would throw this case out as a piece of junk. I mean, no crime existed until the FBI dream went up in its mind. Meaning, let's go test this guy's credibility. I mean, suppose the FBI could do that. They could just, pick 10 people and test credibility and just ask you a question, they have you recorded, and you don't remember it, and then they prosecute you for perjury. I mean, this is ridiculous. You don't go create crimes. The FBI doesn't exist to go create crimes. It exists to investigate crimes. It's a complete misuse of the FBI, completely in disregard of any of the rules that existed, a questionable change in opinion from the FBI to Mueller. In other words, the FBI concluded he wasn't lying, and Mueller concluded that he was in order to prosecute him. And finally, a real question as to the materiality of all this. I mean, ask him whether he talked about sanctions with Kislyak, and you know that he did. What's the materiality of it? You already have that information, which is part of a perjury prosecution. So, I mean, there are many, many reasons why this case should be dismissed by the judge, if for no other reason but to tell the FBI and the Justice Department and independent prosecutors, you can't do this in our system of justice. You're not tricksters. Just because somebody is a political opponent and you want to get rid of them, you can't just kind of trick them into a crime. Short of that, there's a good chance the judge may allow the general to withdraw his guilty plea and to go to trial, in which case there's a very good chance that the new U.S. attorney from St. Louis, who's been put in charge of this case, would come to the conclusion that this case is just an outrage and an embarrassment to the FBI, the Justice Department, and really what would be necessary is a full investigation of the people who did it for whether they had violated his civil rights, as well as the civil rights of the President of the United States. Well, that's at least my opinion, and we'll see what the judge decides, and we'll see if the judge allows it to go forward, which is always possible, dismisses it outright, or allows the plea to be withdrawn, so the Justice Department has to make a decision with regard to a trial. But in any event, it's a very, very sad chapter in our history, and it's something that needs to be fully investigated one way or another so that it doesn't happen to another administration and another unsuspecting staff member who stands in the way of people who basically want to overthrow the president. Well, thank you very much. This is Rudy Giuliani with Common Sense. Today we interviewed Andrew McCarthy, and we'll be back with further comments and interviews very, very shortly. Thank you.
Please subscribe to our backup channels, Net4Truth USA 2 Patriot channel, BitChute.com/net4Truth USA, and drop.space/ Net4Truth USA. We fly so close to the target, we are on our 5th fighter jet. We will be relentless and persistent until the enemies of freedom are defeated. You can support this channel by using the links in the description, but for a $100 donation, I will personally send you a autographed hardcover special edition copy of Land of Childhood's Fears. Also, visit my bookstore at lulu.com/Net4Truth USA. If you are viewing this video on BitChute, you can use the links in the description to support us, or simply click the green $ dot on our video to support this channel. Thank you. Links are in the description section.